I'd like to thank Wiltshire. They're a partner of ours. And what I would also say is that if ever you're in trouble from a legal perspective, and let's say we've unfortunately damaged an existing termite system which has caused havoc, then our man Charles could be the first person that you should see. I'd also like to thank WaterPro for recording today's session. So what's the overview of today's session? What we're going to be looking at is, why do we need to consider termite proofing? Where do I find the rules on termite proofing? And what are the technical requirements? I'm here to tell you that the technical requirements are quite extensive, and hopefully tonight you'll come away with 3 or 4 things that you didn't know previously, which will put you in a better position. So I'll focus on dwelling construction, but not only dwellings, it's really buildings in general. So many projects that involve landscaping work are performed on properties that support buildings, no surprises there, both residential and commercial. Over the last 50 years, many dwellings and some low-rise commercial buildings have been constructed using softwood timber as framing members. Now, what's the problem with softwood? It's susceptible to termite attacks. So, yes, we've been having really a big housing boom over the last 5 years, and it's even more important than ever before that we make sure our termite systems that are in and around those houses are not disturbed. Timber, of course, is susceptible to termite attack, and under the Building Code of Australia, there is a requirement that we have termite protection in place. So if you have a new building, it's highly likely that there will be some form of termite management system. Okay. So what works are we performing, landscapers, that could affect termite protection systems around a building? Paving, planting, decking, stair and ramp construction, and periphery structures such as seating. So if the primary building elements of the building are termite resistant, no system is required. And I had a look at this, and it was interesting that they've amended what is classified as primary building elements. So back in the day, primary building elements was the structure, the frame that was actually holding up the house. Now, the primary building elements also include door jambs, window frames, architraves, and skirtings. And that's for domestic construction. Interestingly, it's not listed for commercial buildings. Commercial buildings, the primary building elements is the structure. But for domestic, those things need to be considered, okay? So the following types of frame construction are considered safe against termite attack. Steel frames, single skin concrete or masonry, structural insulated panels, and naturally durable timbers. How do I know if there is a termite system in place? The first thing you might be thinking is, well, how do I find out what the structure of the building is? Well, generally you can probably do that by having a look in the manhole. But notwithstanding, like I mentioned before, some of those things that we talked about, door jambs, architraves, if they're timber and they're susceptible, then there should be, for new houses, a termite management system in place. Now what you'll find is that depending on the age of the building, these requirements will vary. So like I said, door jambs, they weren't considered previously primary building elements. So you might have a house that is a steel framed house, but has susceptible timbered door jambs, but doesn't have a termite system because it was approved 10 or 15 years ago. So these are kind of the nuances that you've got to look out for. Even saying that, ultimately when you do a job, you have to make sure that job is fit for purpose, okay? So the standards, I like to think of them as a guide, right? Like an important guide, but a guide nevertheless. Because there's always some sort of situation which isn't black or isn't white, but finds itself in grey. And what you have to do is make sure that you're protecting yourself against the grey. So you would lean more on the side of precaution, I would suggest. But back on to where you find information out about termite protection. A durability notice or sticker is required to be placed within the meter box or similar prominent locations for all new homes. This requirement has been around for about 30 years, okay? So houses within the last 30 years ought to have the termite sticker in their meter box. One thing just to be wary of is that around the 1990s, a lot of these stickers were actually placed under the sink, the kitchen sink. So not in the meter box, but in the sink, under the sink. Now the termite sticker will typically show the termite management system used, the date of the installation, and the manufacturer's recommendations pertaining to maintenance. This is a requirement under the Housing Provisions, Part 3.4.3. I'll just give you that hint, just in case you do download it and you're interested. So what are the types of management systems that you could be confronted with? So you could have a visual barrier. A visual barrier is a clear distance that needs to be achieved at slab edge, post, pier or column. You could have a chemical barrier, which is a liquid system applied to the exterior of the building or under the subfloor. You could have a physical barrier, which is a membrane applied around the exterior of the building. Or you could have a monitoring system, which is a series of traps or baits located around a building at common intervals. So, visual barrier. This barrier relies on the building occupants to perform regular maintenance around the building, around the perimeter of the building. So it's a barrier that is a visual barrier around the perimeter of a house or low-rise building. To meet this requirement, a 75mm clear slab edge exposure must be achieved from the finished ground level, landscaping or pavement level, okay? So you may have heard of that distance before. Keep it 75 mils, but it has to be a clear 75 mils around the exterior. Now it's interesting that the slab edge doesn't necessarily need to be a vertical edge. It could even be a horizontal edge. So the 75mm distance is a requirement under clause 4.4, if you're interested, of AS 3660.1. And as I mentioned, it could be a horizontal barrier. The only thing is you'll find that most builders would probably lean against this solution simply because you need more concrete. And concrete's probably expensive enough as it is. But nevertheless, if you saw something like that, that's an option to maintain a visual barrier. If you're working next to a subfloor, you must consider two aspects. One is the 75mm distance, which is provided at the edge of the building to the bottom of the bearer. To the bottom of the bearer. Now that's a tricky one to actually find. Most strip footing, so you'll probably typically find this scenario if the building is in this, 1960s building, which doesn't necessarily mean that all strip footings are relegated in the 1960s, because a lot of people do like to perform additions on the houses, and in some instances they like to replicate the strip footing. So there could be some examples in particular on additions where this may be applicable. So 75 millimetres needs to be maintained around the exterior of the building below the barrier, the bearer. And the other thing to consider is that you need to ensure that the space underneath is appropriately vented. Okay, so that 75 millimetre barrier, although very small, could be used as a venting option as well. So vents will typically be placed around 2.5 to 3 metres around the perimeter of the subfloor. And the other thing is that with the distance between the bottom of the bearer and the ground level, it should be 400 millimetres. And the reason for that is, or the idea, is that you go in there and you can inspect it yourself. Okay, so you have a look. So 400 millimetres is the minimum that you need. So with posts, piers and stumps, they can use stirrups with a 75 millimetre stem at the base. These can be used on verandas, carports and decks. When applied to decks, once again, a minimum 400 millimetre space shall be provided between the bearer and the ground so that an inspection can take place. That's a really important part, actually, and I'll talk about decks now. If you do build a deck, okay, typically I would assume that the deck would be around the finished floor level so that you could transition from inside to out, typically going out to your backyard, okay. Now, if you do place a deck there and you do not get that clear 400 millimetre space for inspection, then you cannot use a visual barrier, okay. There's a couple of ways we'll talk about what you can do, but you cannot use a visual barrier because you cannot actually get underneath, okay. So we'll talk about other barriers, what you could do in those particular circumstances. Alternate to stirrups, caps can be used to prevent termites building their mud trails up the post. A gap no more than 0.4 millimetres, which is very tiny, can be left between the post and the cap. Caps must extend 40 millimetres past the post and be provided with a downturn angle of 45 degrees. Caps should be made of metal varying from 0.4 to 0.5 millimetres, pending its material. Okay, so there's a range of materials, for example, like stainless steel, that can be used. The idea in this instance is that the termites build their mud trails, they reach the cap, they try and get around the cap and fall off. All right, well, that's how it was explained to me. Nevertheless, it is an inspection space that should be viewed as well. So if you have a cap, they should be inspected. You should be able to inspect them. Although not common in South Australia, masonry cladding can extend to natural ground level. So a 75 millimetre distance must be clear and maintained to the bottom of the damp proof. Okay. However, an additional barrier of protection is also required in the form of termite sheeting. This was an interesting one for me, that in such an instance, you have to ensure that some form of termite sheeting is also in place in this instance where you've got the masonry cladding. So I guess you can see there, the masonry, what we're saying is the masonry extends all the way down into the ground. Not very common in South Australia, but if you're confronted with this, there ought to be, in compliance with today's standard, some form of termite sheeting that sits under what they call as a flashing, but is effectively the damp-proof course, okay? The damp-proof course doesn't necessarily mean, or doesn't necessarily provide termite protection, okay? It depends on the damp-proof course. So your bitumen type of damp-proof courses do not provide adequate termite protection. So you will need something in addition for that. If you were building it or reconstructing it, you would need some form of termite sheet, which actually refers to the physical barrier, which we'll talk about in a second. First, we'll talk about chemical barriers. So that was the visual barriers. Chemical barriers are another option for a termite system. So these types of barriers are often referred to as spray. However, since 2017, chemical barriers in South Australia are the least used management system. Okay? This was because there was a law change on the 1st of May 2017, which required chemical termite management systems to be replenished systems. Okay? So if they were concealed and you couldn't access, they were inaccessible, you had to make sure that the chemical treatment could be replenished. So old chemical spray barriers provided generally 30 years of protection, and I'm talking back in the 80s or sooner or later or earlier. They were eventually phased out due to health concerns. And the recent chemical sprays generally have a lifespan of about 10 years. So given that the change in regulation occurred in 2017, it's highly likely that a lot of buildings, new buildings, don't have, and I guess I'm talking in the last decade, don't have, or if they do have a chemical spray, that has probably run out, like its lifetime has expired. Once again, if you're curious, it should be on the termite sticker in the meter box. So you can see the pictures on the right-hand side, courtesy of Termimesh. They show effectively a piping system that runs around the exterior of the building, where you inject the fluid into them once every 5 or so years. And that is now considered a chemical barrier. As I said, not very highly utilised in South Australia, and in truth, when I asked the question of the termite suppliers, management suppliers, generally they steer you away from chemical applications. The chemical barrier is in place. The distance from the bottom of the damp-proof course, okay, this is an important one. If there is a chemical barrier, the distance from the bottom of the damp-proof course and the ground level can be reduced to 15 millimetres. Okay, that's under the National Construction Code. Two aspects are considered when using this distance: that the termite barrier is a continuous one around the whole house, and that the distance is primarily in place to stop moisture entering the building. Okay. The distance may be applied to certain physical barriers. However, it is best to check the manufacturer of the barrier to determine their recommended clearance. Physical barriers. So physical barriers are the most common form of protection. And there are two common types that have been used in South Australia. Termimesh, you're probably familiar with that product. It is a sheet or termite sheet, as how the standard explains it. It's like a mesh. We've got some photos coming up in a second. That's placed around the perimeter of the building. And interestingly, you still need to have a clearance from below the Termimesh maintained at least 20 millimetres. It's effectively a visual clearance, or it's nominated as a visual clearance. You can also have cordon. So it's an orange sheeting that is also placed around the perimeter of the building. It can act as a damp-proof course. So I said that some don't, cordon does. So it can act as a damp-proof course. If you use cordon, their specifications state that there must be a minimum of a 75mm clearance below the product. Probably thinking to yourself, what does it look like? Well, we'll show you in a second. So here is Termimesh, a specification, and here it details I'll see if I can use the pointer, 20mm distance from the bottom of the actual, the mesh itself. Cordon is an orange product. It was something I saw in my past profession as an inspector on quite a few occasions. I haven't been out and about looking at buildings recently, but back in the early 2000s, I would say it had quite a fairly high take-up. It's distinguishable by its orange texture, or colour I should say, and in line with their specifications, a lot of the protection looks very similar to what the standards suggest, keeping in mind that yes, you do actually need a 75mm clearance. And you can see here on the stumps, you might not be super clear, but on the stumps they've actually got it as well. And you can also have what's called a mineral granular system. So this form of barrier is effectively a filling of crushed rocks. It is permissible surrounding posts and stump connections. It requires the structure to be fully encased with a nominal 100mm of compact granules, which shall be compacted where over 150mm in depth and extend at least 50mm above the finished ground level, landscape or paved level. Granular is, yes, it's not something that is very much used, but it is in the standard and it allows you to use it as protection. So from your perspective, it could potentially be used on posts. Monitoring systems. So this form of barrier requires baiting systems to be placed around the perimeter of the building. These systems are covered under clause 5.2.2 of AS 3660.2. Because this standard is not referenced within the Building Code of Australia, they are not likely to be installed within new homes. So the NCC comments on AS 3660.1, but it doesn't make reference to point 2, probably because point 2 deals with existing buildings. They are easily found, identified as round discs commonly. Stations are placed within 2 metres around the perimeter of a building, spaced between 2 and 3 metres apart. Attachments to buildings. Structures not provided with a termite management system under AS 3660.1 that an adjacent a building required, sorry, I should actually, I've got the wrong word there, structures that are provided with termite management systems. So I'll just take a step back. When a termite management system is in place, adjacent a building, any structures that are installed close to the building should have a separation distance of 25mm. Okay, so that includes steps, access ramps, verandas, carports, trellises, decks, hot water systems, air conditioners, tanks, and pumps. So if the building needs a termite management system, then these type of attachments should have a separation distance of 25mm. Now, I know what you're going to say. It's pretty hard for a veranda to be hovering in midair. Yes, Kate?
Yeah, well, if it says there, if the attachment has no termite susceptible path, so there's no timber in a hot water system, for example.
Yep.
How?
Why would it be a danger? Yeah, good question. And I'll show you some photos, okay? Because what you have to understand is that when there's an existing termite barrier, and if it's a physical barrier, remember they need to have clearances, right? What you could be doing is you could be breaching that clearance. So for example, if you look at the stairs on the left-hand side, if you look at it, it looks like, perhaps a strip footing underneath. On top of the strip footing, there could be the physical barrier. If you put a set of stairs reaching ground level above the barrier, you're breaching the barrier, okay? So even though the element that you're putting next to the building might itself not be susceptible to termite attack, it can act as a bridging pathway to the building itself.
But if the termites walk up that tank?
I thought you were going to ask if they walk up the stairs.
I
wouldn't want to see that coming. Yeah. So the tank. So you can just, good question. It's like I had you as my backup to point out. So you can see here that the connection into the building, there's some sort of connection on the side. So there, that could be potentially where they go through. Yeah, that's right.
If you just had the tank without anybody into the building, would that still be a problem?
Yeah, in accordance with the standard it is.
And how?
Because if you think about it, if you could have, if you rested against the brickwork as is in that photo, the brickwork itself, I've seen plenty of examples where the mortar is deteriorated away.
Right.
And that's the pathway that they can get in.
So the tank has to be touching the wall, is it?
Yeah, if it's, or within 25 millimetres.
So it jump across.
Yeah. I've seen a jumping spider. I don't know about the termites, but no, it's, yes. The standard says 25 millimetres. Now, I don't know how good their mud building is, whether they build a bridge in mud. They could. Yeah.
But it's also because if you need to have the visual bit as well, it's you for be able to see
it. Yeah, that's right. Yeah, exactly. So if you look at the top picture, we've got the deck. Once again, looks like some form of strip footing, making a presumption that the actual termite protection is at the top of that strip footing. The deck itself then obviously goes over the top and could lead to potential problems. And of course, the old classic on the bottom where you have your perimeter paving and you can't see the damp-proof course. And here we have what appears to be evidence of efflorescence, which is salt damage to the building, typically when there is no moisture, when moisture can't egress the building, it stays within the building. And of course, termites love a really moist environment. So you've really got two problems there in one. So points to consider. Will the work I do breach an existing termite management system? First thing is really, do they have one? And then if they do, will it breach the termite management system? Structures that are typically situated at ground level, such as stairs, access ramps, and decks, should not sit higher than the visual clearance necessary if the termite management system requires it. All primary building elements must be considered, as I mentioned, door jambs and window frames. Even if the frame is made from steel, that's the light gauge steel framing for house as an example. Other elements may need protection, which I've just mentioned. Don't disregard verandas and carport attachments, okay, because they are attached. The examples that we showed with the stairs breaching, a veranda technically does the same thing, albeit a much longer distance, okay, but it's still doing the same thing. It still could be breaching the termite protection barrier. So this is an example from Termimesh as to what they do if the system is not directly underneath the brickwork. And you can kind of see it there, but the application is pretty much on the side of the slab in each of these instances, inclusive of the deck. And interestingly enough, and this is where you always have to double check what the manufacturer's specifications say. And in this instance, if you have a deck and you use a Termimesh, your recommendation is that it still is 15 millimetres away from the building, which is a little bit different from the standard, which is 25 millimetres. But this is what the manufacturer wants, right? Not forgetting the manufacturer is a product. They have to make sure the product is fit for purpose. So in their eyes, if it was associated with a deck, then there should be a 15 millimetre clearance as well. Decks are probably easier to manage, that clearance, and in some regards stairs, like a preformed concrete staircase, you probably could easily put 25 millimetres away from a building without too much incident. But there are others which are a little bit more tricky. So, overview. Landscape constructors and maintenance people. Listen now. Before starting a project, you need to assess the site. Part of this process could include a check sheet as follows. Is there an existing termite management system in place? If so, what is the management system? What are the common management systems used? Think about that. If you don't know what it is, try and find out just by evidence around the building. For example, I mentioned about cordon and an orange sheeting. That's a giveaway that you've probably got a cordon protected house. Will the work I perform affect those systems? Do I need to perform rectification to existing systems or put new ones in? There's another one for you. Do you need to rectify the system if you're altering it? Charles, I might even put that to you. What do you reckon? Tough one.
If you need to put one in, if you...
Yeah, let's say we're altering a baiting system. Let's say we're removing a couple of baits.
Depends what the contract says, potentially.
Yes, which is, so that's where your scope of works is, you have to be really clear. Firstly, the importance of contracts cannot be underestimated. A quote is, correct me if I'm wrong, a quote is a contract. Yep. You can also have a verbal contract if you want. That's a lot harder to prove in court. But have something in writing which lists the work that you do and where your responsibilities lie and where they don't. What's the level of risk? That's always the thing that I look at, right? Back in my days when I was doing inspections and so forth. What is the level of risk? And to be honest, anything to do with water or termites, to me, that's a high level of risk. So you better treat that with the utmost respect that it deserves. And I would say, yes, any sort of alteration to existing systems, I personally would be reluctant to leave it as an unfinished continuous system around the house. Very reluctant, very reluctant. All right, so we talked about rectification. Contact the manufacturer or supplier to get advice as well. If you can identify what the system is, and sometimes you might through the termite sticker, the durability notice, contact the supplier. Landscape designers, well, you might want to be very cautious on your documentation to make reference to the two standards we've talked about tonight. Identify what specifications need to be nominated. Do the following standards need referencing within the design? Are you doing design work around the perimeter of the house? And if so, and you're the designer, are you guiding the contractor the best possible way that you could? And once again, where does your liability sit if you provide a design that doesn't give clear instruction as to the risks associated with the works that are being undertaken. It can be really simple, and a simple note within the specifications identifying that the work to be performed is in accordance with AS 3660.1 or 0.2, depending on the situation. So if responsibilities, well, we've talked about them in great detail. I think you can understand now that if you do work which results in potentially damaging the property, you could potentially be liable or have some portion of liability that sits on your shoulders. And that is a wrap.